I think radical Islam is a threat to the world. And I think we need partly, I don't know why the word partly came out. I think we need to be prepared somewhat to enter into a dialogue with Muslims, since there are somewhere between 3 million and 6 million in America, and no doubt more to come, as we are taking refugees. And I'll tell you my opinion on that. I believe that America, as well as all other countries, should help refugees. I'm not sure that we have to bring them to America in order to help them. I don't buy into that theory. I think the best thing we can do, I mean, everybody wants to be at home, right? I think that if we can help bring about peace, that people would prefer to be in their own home, their own surroundings, in their own country. And so we work for that, and we keep them comfortable as we can in refugee camps. I'm not opposed to bringing them over here. I am opposed to our government's very shoddy and weak process in which they weed out the crazies. I think the government is inept at that. And I think there's been enough happen in America and the European nations for us to understand that we're letting a lot of people get through that would be better off left somewhere else. I talked to a lady that is, she's in the military, or well, actually her husband's in the military in Germany, stationed in Germany. And Germany has taken a lot of the Syrian refugees, and in one village, there was pretty much all men that they stationed there. And then there was a village in which there were a lot of women and children. And so these military wives, mainly, decided that they wanted to do something nice for them. And so they fixed them all a meal, and they took them out to the men. And the men were rude, aggressive, hostile, and treated the women with utter contempt. And they went to the women and children, and they received a totally different reception. The women were very gracious, and the children were, of course, grateful for the food and for the outreach. But the escorts that went with the women said that they were not allowed to go back to the men, because the men were speaking of raping the women the next time they came and all that. And that's really not a problem among, we'll say radicals, but it's really not a problem in Islam to rape an unbeliever. They consider an infidel. That's permissible. And so they were told not to go back there. They're here, they're trying to reach out to people and help them, and it was greeted in a horrible way. Now, whenever we think about Muslims, most of the time our minds automatically think Arabic, but only 20 to 25% of Muslims are Arabs, which is a little bit surprising to most people. How many Muslims are there in the world? There's about 1.5 billion. So you got 20 to 25% that are Arab. Where do the rest of them live? Well, the country with the most Muslims is Indonesia. Galen Jones's dad and his mother were missionaries in Indonesia, and they did not really run into any opposition. They were treated pretty well, helped out at times by the Muslims there, but that's been a while ago. If you remember, and this has been a while ago too, hasn't it? You remember when that big tsunami hit Indonesia and killed, just thousands and thousands of people? The attitude in the Muslims had changed to the point that the U.S. aircraft bringing in relief supplies were not allowed to touch down. They had to drop them from the planes. That's how much the hostility towards America among the Muslim world had changed. I have talked to missionaries in Africa that would hire Muslims as guides who would ensure their safety and help them out in every way. But that too is changing dramatically as the Muslims are growing increasingly hostile, not just the radical, but the Muslims are growing increasingly hostile to the Western world. Now, why is that? To be honest, part of it is our interference in their politics. And they feel like, and especially in the oil-producing countries, they feel like we are taking their oil and we're giving it to a very few people. Meanwhile, the majority of the people receive none of it, and somehow or another that's Americans' fault. Colonialism still leaves a bitter taste in the Muslim world, because at one time, up until World War I and World War II, you know that all sorts of countries in Africa were under the umbrella of either Great Britain or France, let's see, I'm trying to think, the Netherlands, Portugal. You had all these European countries that were basically dictating what was going on in the Muslim world, and that's left a lingering bad feeling in Muslim countries. Now, if I were to say who is the strongest ally among the Muslim nations, what would your answer be? Who is the strongest ally we have that is a Muslim country? Well, it's going to be Saudi Arabia. But both of the answers are very good. We have good relationships with those countries. But Saudi Arabia really, really depends on America. And the reason they do is because they are scared to death of Iraq and Iran. And so they love us, and they love our guns, they love our planes, they love the weapons we give them, and a lot of the oil money as well. Now, what kind of government does Saudi Arabia have? They have a kingdom. Now, we insert ourselves and try to establish democracies in a lot of countries. We've never even thought about doing that to Saudi Arabia. Why? See, we're inconsistent. I'm talking about we, the American government. We've been inconsistent. Yeah, we hadn't learned a lot, Tim, on some of this stuff.
Because Saudi Arabia has been fairly stable. I mean, we've supported them, and we don't want to interrupt the flow of oil.
We don't want to interrupt the flow of oil. Even though they are the most conservative, or close to the most conservative country. Here's the interesting thing. Does anybody really know what caused what's his name? Bin Laden? What's his name? I can't. Yeah, Bin Laden. What caused him who was a Saudi Arabian? What caused him to react so hostile towards America? Saudi Arabia let us station troops in Saudi Arabia during the first Persian Gulf War, and no infidel is supposed to be allowed foot in their country. And as far as he's concerned, there's no greater infidels than Americans. Now, why do they view Americans as such infidels? Christianity is part of it, but the Quran actually teaches them to respect the people of the book, which means Jews and Christians. Now, I will explain that, and I already have. But why do they view America as the great Satan. And our interference in their politics is part of it. We want to impose Western ideas. True Islam does not want democracy. It does not. They would say they have a form of it, and I guess you could say it is a form of it. They do not want democracy. They want Sharia law, which is a theocracy. That's where I'm getting to. It's our culture. Yeah, and he got kicked out of the Jehovah's Witnesses for that. Now, there's a third thing that I hadn't been to Turkey, so I don't know. But in non-English speaking world, there's graffiti over on everything that they can paint. And what does it usually say? American curse words. Where do they get that? Our movies. And just think about how many movies have been made in which you take God's name in vain. How many movies have been made in which there are sex scenes outside of marriage, in marriage, whatever. So our influence is viewed as being totally non-Muslim. It's immoral. Now, it's kind of hard to argue that. Now, that's not necessarily representative of America, but, you know, a movie comes out that's got all that stuff, and Americans flock to it, don't they? Even Christians. And there's another factor that we can never leave out why Muslim countries hate America so much. America is the biggest supporter of Israel there is. And now Mr. Obama has not been, he's not been as pro-Israel as presidents before him, but Israel, you can talk to a Muslim from anywhere in the world that is a practicing Muslim. You can talk to a practicing Muslim, and if you mention two things, you might as well smack their mother. One of them is Israel, because there's a hatred there that's taught from day one. And part of that has to do with Muhammad's experience when he starts preaching and saying he was a prophet. The first group that rejected him were Jews. And he has some horrible things to say about the Jews in the Quran. He describes them as apes and gorillas and treacherous people. But the way the nation of Israel has treated the Palestinians, but there's something underlying that too, and that is once Muslims take control of an area, they are never supposed to relinquish control of that territory. So there's two things there that really bothers them. The way the Israelis have mistreated the Palestinians. Maybe not as much as the Palestinian leadership has, but still, they have mistreated them. I mean, you're living in the same spot that your ancestors have for, 1,000 years, and you wake up and you hear a noise and they're pushing your house down and they're driving you out to add more apartments for Jewish settlement. I mean, that's kind of wrong, right? I mean, that's just not good. You were going to say something, Chad? Well, jihad's an interesting subject. if you're talking to a sensible Muslim that's not been radicalized, jihad, the greater jihad is, see, most of what we're going to talk about is the radicals, and that's not really fair. And by the way, I'll say some things that sound very harsh, but I promise you, I go out of my way not to misrepresent, because I don't like to misrepresent people. I think that's unethical. And that's, I hate to hear members of the Church of Christ say, well, the Baptists believe. Well, you got to be clear on that. Which brand of Baptist are you talking about? And where did you get your information from? Just because some Baptist told you something doesn't make it so for that whole church or that denomination. You may have been talking to a nut. But we tend to quote people as if they're authorities, and they may not know what they're talking about. I don't want to be guilty of that. Jihad, the greater jihad is, we can all, look, there are some things, and I believe in starting off with things that we can agree on. I'll give you a quick example, and I'll come back and answer your question. I personally don't have a problem if we put a cross up here. I don't. But, and you know, most churches of Christ growing up, oh boy, you didn't put a cross up anywhere in the building, not even on the Lord's Supper table. Why? Because people end up worshiping the cross. Now, I don't think we would, but there are people, obviously in Catholicism, which is what most, and Orthodox, which is what most Muslims deal with. But the day Saud Imam came here, the Wednesday night, my friend from Saudi Arabia, he walked in the back door and he says, "Where's your cross?" And I said, "We don't have one." He said, "I thought every church had one." I said, "See, you need to know more about Christianity." I said, "What you're familiar with is the crucifix up there." And I says, we're as scared of idolatry as you are. Because the greatest sin in Islam is shirk, it's idolatry. I said, we're not going to try to tempt people to worship something, and you know, because there's all sorts of weird stuff goes on among certain Catholics, and crosses and locations and all that, and the same is true of Orthodox. And that led me to a whole other subject, but I'll come back to your question. The greater jihad that we can relate to is the personal struggle against evil within yourself in your own life. And see, we can agree with that, right? We don't use the word jihad. We say spiritual warfare. Now, the idea of jihad destroying your enemy, it's always been there, but it's as far as running around and blowing each other up and blowing anybody and everybody up, I think probably that's on the increase, and it's really started somewhere, I'm guessing somewhere around the 19th century. It's always been present, but it's growing in popularity. Now, you only get to do it once. So you got to recruit other people. And a lot of Muslim clerics preach to their congregation, that's the way you should die. And they teach their children that. I know you've seen documentaries where they're firing the kids up. If you want to see something terribly horrific, look up Jihad Bunny. Look at what Palestinian kids watch on TV on Saturday morning for cartoons. Just go ahead and look that up. Not right now, but you're going to understand where true hatred comes from. And you're going to be amazed. Anyway, it's a children's TV show with animal characters on it who constantly talk about killing Jews. And that's the right thing to do. That's their Saturday morning cartoons. And they're broadcast in places other than Palestine. But anyway, so we can relate. Jihad, yes, the real important war is controlling ourselves and living for God. So we can use that terminology. The thing is that should bother everybody in the Muslim world is most of the bombs that are being set off and blowing people up, who are they killing? Fellow Muslims. Well, they're not supposed to do that under any circumstance. So how do they justify it? Different sects, or they consider them heretics. Who is a true Muslim? Well, anybody can define who a true Muslim is. So if I decide I don't like these guys that pray, 6 times a day, I mean, that's a silly illustration, but if I decide that they're wrong, I can kill them because I've done the world a favor. I've removed heretics that are spreading false doctrine around. So sex, the thing that's going on, I'm telling you folks, I think there was far more legitimacy to the war in Vietnam than us being in Syria. That's my opinion. Because when we lost to Vietnam, the freedom of religion went away. Communism came in. Communism is horrible. It's horrible. Now, what are we fighting for in Syria? Does anybody know? Nobody knows. But you go and you look at this explanation given by a so-called expert from Great Britain, and you got Russia in there, and